"I've slept with men I didn't love," she said, but the cowboy look in her eyes and said, "You're still worthy of real love, and I'm still here." The late summer wind in Minnesota is like nowhere else. It doesn't just sweep across the lakes and through the birch forests as if to soothe the hot days. It carries the earthy smell of dry grass, the cool, fresh scent of deep lake water, and a touch of the lonely melancholy of a land that has witnessed too many migrations, too many farewells. I sat pressed against the side of the wagon, my hands clenched tightly around the straps of my cloth bag, listening to the grinding of the wooden wheels on the rutted, gravelly road. The path from the old settlement to the town of Willow Creek was longer than I had imagined, and each stretch seemed to endlessly unravel under the fading sun. If your heart skips a beat for cowboy love stories filled with danger, secrets, and redemption, comment number 1 and your place below. Let's ride this tale together on Wild West Love. I had left behind the Dakota village where I was born, the wooden stilt house my father built with his calloused hands, the small cemetery where my mother rested under a simple stone carved with our ancestors' language. I thought I had left behind the painful memories too that winter night when a white man promised me marriage, then left, taking with him the money I'd saved over 3 years of selling my handicrafts at the market. But it turned out that memories are like shadows. The more you run, the closer they follow. A sharp, cracking sound made me jump. The front left wheel of the wagon broke its axle, and the carriage tipped sharply to one side before sliding into a ditch. I was thrown forward violently, my knee hitting the wooden floor with a searing pain. The frantic shouts of the other passengers mingled with the neighing of the horses and the howling wind. Dust flew up in a thick cloud, clinging to my hair, my skin, and every breath I took. I propped myself up and quickly brushed the dust off my dress. My knee was bleeding and my palms were raw, but I didn't cry. I had stopped crying long ago, from the day I realized that tears changed nothing except revealing my weakness. The driver was muttering curses, trying to calm the panicked horses. 2 old women huddled in the wagon, and the man who'd boarded in Cheyenne remained silent as a log, not even bothering to look up. I looked around. The dirt road stretched on endlessly, flanked by patches of weeds that had turned a grayish yellow. In the distance, low hills undulated like the backs of old buffalo resting. There was not a single house, not a soul in sight. Willow Creek, where I hoped to find a new job at the inn, was still at least half a day's journey away. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with the familiar feeling of someone who has been left stranded many times, just close enough to see the goal, but still too far to reach it. "Are you all right?" A low, quiet voice from behind me made me spin around. My fingers unconsciously slid down to my boot, where I kept a small knife. But the man standing there didn't seem threatening. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his thick black hair ruffled by the wind, his skin dark and weathered by the sun. His smoke-gray eyes watched me quietly, as if he saw more than what I was saying. A worn rifle rested on his shoulder, a hunting knife hung at his hip, and the brim of his cowboy hat shaded his stern face from the setting sun. "I'm fine," I replied, quickly brushing my dress again. "Are you from Willow Creek?" He nodded once. "My name is Thomas Red Elk. I was just coming back from the ranch and saw your wheel break." His eyes glanced at the tipped wagon. "They won't be able to fix that without tools." "I know," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. In this situation, I didn't like being told what to do. The corner of Thomas's mouth twitched, a smile that never fully formed. "I was heading for the inn in town," I continued. "I guess I'll have to walk now." "You won't get there before dark," he replied, his voice even. Not a threat, but a simple statement of fact. "And you don't want to be out here after nightfall." "Len, I've slept in worse places," I sigged. "Maybe," Thomas tilted his head. "But riding is better. My horse can carry 2. I hesitated. Trust was something I no longer gave easily. But there was something in the way he spoke, unforced, unhurried, that made me feel I could try. "All right," I nodded. "But I have a knife." "Good," he said, stepping aside to let me pass. "That means you know how to take care of yourself." We started on our way. The horse's hooves struck the hard dirt road with a steady, unhurried rhythm. I sat behind him, a small space between my back and his sturdy one hand gripping the saddle horn, the other holding my bag. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the grass, a searing heat that softened as the sun began to drop behind the distant hills. "Do you have family in Willow Creek?" Thomas asked, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "No, not anymore," I replied. He glanced back briefly but didn't ask anything else, and I was grateful for that. Silence is sometimes the greatest gift. After a moment, I said softly, "I'm not looking to be saved, if that's what you're thinking." "I'm not thinking anything," he replied. "You need a ride, and I have a horse." We continued in silence. The closer we got to dusk, the colder the wind became. On the road, I thought about all the things I had left behind. A part of my youth, my trust, and the mornings I used to wake up feeling like I still had someone to look forward to. Now, all I had was myself, and a long road with no end in sight. As the horizon began to turn purple, Thomas spoke up. "There's a storm coming in. We won't make it to town dry. My cabin is closer." Before I could answer, the first drops of cold rain lashed my face. I nodded, gripping the saddle tighter as he urged his horse onto a trail that led through the birch forest. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves filled my nostrils, and the sound of the rain mingled with the frantic beating of my heart. I didn't know if it was because I was tired, hungry, or because of the calm look in his eyes when he glanced back, but I realized this was the first time in months that I had let someone lead me, without trying to guess the destination. The trail through the birch woods opened into a small clearing by the lake, where Thomas's cabin stood silently, as if it had been there since before the trail was made. The sloped roof was covered with wooden planks, weathered silver by the sun and wind. The walls were tightly fitted together, and a thin wisp of smoke, like an ash-colored thread, curled from the chimney and dissolved into the falling rain. The horse stopped in front of the porch, snorted, and stood still as if it were a place it knew well. Thomas dismounted first, tied the reins to a post, and then offered me his hand. I hesitated for a second but placed my cold hand in his. His skin was warm, dry, and strong, not overbearing, just a sufficient, steady support. When I stepped onto the ground, the soft mud gave way slightly under my boots, and the smell of wet grass rose up, mixing with the scent of the horse's leather and a faint hint of wood smoke. "Get inside," he said briefly, opening the wooden door. The hinges creaked softly, and warmth spilled out as if someone had just pulled a thick blanket from the fire and draped it over me. The inside of the cabin was simple but tidy. A square wooden table was set near the hearth, with 2 chairs. On a shelf were a few sparse items: a jar of salt, a pouch of cornmeal, a hunting knife, and some coils of rope. In one corner, there was a single bed with a brown wool blanket, and on the floor near the fireplace was a thin mattress, neatly rolled up. I realized he had read my mind when he said, "I'll sleep here." The tone was calm, as if it were a matter of course. I didn't reply, just walked closer to the hearth, holding my cold hands out to the flames. The small fire burned steadily, its warm orange light reflecting off the calluses on my fingers. A moment later, I heard a rustling from a wooden cabinet behind me, and then Thomas placed some dried meat, a bag of beans, and a jar of coffee on the table. "It's not much," he said, "but it's enough to fill our stomachs." I glanced at him, intending to refuse, but my stomach betrayed me with a soft rumble. We prepared dinner together. He poured beans into a pot, added water and salt, and put it on the fire. I cut the dried meat into pieces, and its salty, fatty smell brought back memories of outdoor meals with my father when I was a child before everything changed. While we waited for the pot to boil, I asked, "Have you lived here alone long?" 4 years, he replied, still watching the pot. "Before that, my brother and I were at a cattle ranch out west. He died of a fever, on the trail bringing the herd back." Though, I fell silent, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I understood the feeling of losing a loved one on the road. After a moment, I said, "I used to have a place called home, and a person. But he left, taking everything. My money, my things, and all the trust I had in people." Thomas didn't turn around, but I saw his shoulders shift slightly, as if he was bearing a part of the weight of my story. "Did that happen out east?" he asked. I nodded, even though he couldn't see. When the meal was ready, we sat facing each other at the table. The rain on the porch was a steady rhythm, like a distant drum. I held my spoon, taking a mouthful of the hot beans and dried meat. The taste was simple but warmed me from my mouth down to my stomach. We ate in silence for a long time. I didn't know why I spoke. Maybe because the firelight softened his face, or because in this room, silence was no longer a barrier. "I'm not the kind of woman men around here usually want to marry," I said, my voice as flat as the lake surface before a storm. "I'm not as whole as they like to imagine." Thomas put his spoon down and looked up at me. His gaze was unwavering. "I never asked for that," he replied, his voice low and slow. I waited, thinking he would ask why or what happened. But he didn't. He just continued, "You don't owe me an explanation, but thank you for telling me." I felt a part of my chest, which had been tightly shut, open a small crack. After dinner, I got up and walked to the window. The rain tapped softly against the glass, each long drop like a silver thread. "I don't expect anything," I said, my eyes still fixed on the darkness outside. "I just want to start over, without anyone pulling me back." He stood up, came closer, and stopped beside me without touching me. "Then start here," he said. "You're safe." I turned to look at him. The firelight fell on half his face, the other half in shadow. But his eyes were clear, not prying, not pitying. I nodded, very slightly, a silent agreement. We didn't talk much more that night. I unrolled the mattress near the fireplace, and he kept his word, laying his blanket on the floor. The wind blowing through a crack in the door brought in the damp smell of grass and smoke, but inside, the warmth kept me from shivering. For the first time in months, I fell into a deep sleep without waking up in the middle of the night. The next morning, I was woken by the rhythmic thud of an axe chopping wood. I opened my eyes and saw Thomas outside on the porch, his every swing neat and precise. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still damp, and the air smelled of forest leaves. I stepped out, standing on the porch, my arms wrapped around myself. He looked up, and the sweat on his forehead glistened in the pale early light. "Coffee's almost ready," he said. I didn't know how long I would stay, but that morning, as the smell of coffee filled the small cabin, I realized that maybe, sometimes, starting over just takes a place quiet enough to hear your own heart, and a person who knows when to be silent. I left the cabin on a cool morning, when dew still clung to the willow branches by the lake. Thomas walked with me to the trail, where the dirt path connected to the main road leading into town. He said he would take me all the way to Martha Ironclad's inn, and I just nodded, keeping my cloth bag neatly on my lap as I rode behind him. The horse walked slowly, its steps as steady as the breath of the autumn earth, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke from distant houses. Willow Creek appeared when the sun was high in the sky. The town wasn't big, a main road covered in gravel, with 2 rows of wooden buildings facing each other: the blacksmith, the general store, the saloon, and finally, the inn. It was a 2-story house made of pine, its white paint faded, but the front porch was swept clean, and a few pots of yellow chrysanthemums were neatly placed on either side of the door. Martha stood in the doorway, a short but sturdy woman with her hair in a tight bun and eyes as sharp as a newly honed knife. "Here for a job?" she asked as soon as I stepped onto the porch. I nodded. She asked a series of questions. "Can you do laundry? Can you cook? Can you handle hard work?" I answered each one, my voice steady, my eyes not flinching. When she said, "Start with the bed sheets," I didn't wait, taking the basket she handed me. The first few days in Willow Creek were harder than I expected. My arms ached from scrubbing the thick sheets with a brush. My back was sore from carrying buckets of water up and down the stairs, and the smell of soap mixed with the metallic scent from the rusty wash basin clung to my skin. In the evenings, when the guests were settled, I would sit by the window in my small room on the second floor, looking out at the dark road and the narrow strip of sky. Somewhere out there was the lake and Thomas's cabin. I didn't know what he was doing, maybe mending a fence or starting a fire, but the thought of a quiet place, where I had heard the words, "You're safe," from a man without any conditions attached, made my heart feel less heavy. Every Thursday afternoon, I would give myself an hour to walk west of town, to where the willows grew by the creek. From a big rock there, I could see the distant hills, the direction of the small path to the cabin. I never went any further, just sat and occasionally threw a few pebbles into the water, listening to the soft plop that broke the silence. That was when I let the old memories surface and drift away, like golden leaves floating down a stream. One such afternoon, as I was walking back to town, Thomas appeared at the end of the street. He was standing next to a wagon carrying coils of wire, his hat pulled low, his shadow long on the road. When he saw me, he just gave a slight nod and said, "You look stronger." I replied, "I've been working." "It suits you," he said, more as a statement of fact than a compliment. We walked side by side for a few houses, unhurried. I told him a little about Martha, strict but fair, and about the feeling of earning my keep with my own hands. He just listened, nodding occasionally. At the end of the street, he stopped. "I want to show you something," he said. We walked around the back of the blacksmith's row, where the sound of hammering had stopped, leaving only the smell of cold iron and dry earth. A wooden fence ran along the grass behind the horse stalls, and we leaned against it, watching the sun dip toward the hills. "I used to think that starting over meant erasing everything," I said, my eyes following the red-orange light as it slipped past the treetops. As if I could just wipe clean everything that had ever touched me. "La, you don't think that anymore?" I shook my head. "Now I think it's about learning to carry it more lightly." He was silent, then said, "I don't need you to be brand new. I just need you to be how you are now." I turned to look at him, and my heart sank in a strange way, not from sadness, but from the realization that I had walked for so long without ever hearing a sentence like that. "If you hold my hand," I said slowly, "I don't want it to be just to pass the time." "Lie." "It's not," he replied without hesitation. We didn't touch each other then. But when I went back to the inn that evening, my footsteps were lighter, and in my hand was a new hair tie, not a gift, just the one I had left by the creek the day before, and he had picked up. In the days that followed, my work was still as hard as ever. The calluses on my hands grew thicker, but those same hands were also finding a new rhythm for life. Opening windows to let the light pour into the living room, folding sheets neatly, and wiping the wooden tables until they gleamed in the lamplight. I thought about the man who had betrayed me less than before. Whenever the memory surfaced, it felt more like a healed scar than an open wound. In the evenings, after the guests were asleep, I would often sit by the window, sometimes mending clothes, sometimes just looking at the moon. And somewhere out there was a cabin by the lake, its light possibly on, and a man with smoke-colored eyes, who was just as patient as he had been on the first afternoon we met. I didn't know what the future held, but I was starting to understand that rebirth wasn't a single brilliant moment, but a series of ordinary days pieced together, long enough to gradually erase the shadows. By the end of October, the wind from the lake was carrying the cold scent of winter. The willow trees had begun to shed their yellow leaves, their bare branches like thin arms reaching up to the gray sky. I had just finished the last load of laundry for the day when I heard the sound of horse hooves on the main road. Looking through the window, I saw Thomas standing next to his brown horse, his hat pulled low, his face half lit and half shadowed. That afternoon, we left town on the trail that ran along the creek. The slanting sunlight shone on the rippling water, illuminating the white specks of foam floating downstream. Thomas didn't say much, only occasionally turning to make sure I was keeping up. After more than an hour of walking, we arrived at a clearing by the lake, where a semicircle of birch trees stood, their fallen leaves glistening in the late afternoon sun. I stood in the middle of the clearing, the wind rustling the last golden leaves on the branches, each one trembling as if it wanted to fall but was holding on for one more moment. The lake in the distance was calm, reflecting the honey-colored sky, but inside me, waves were churning. I began, my voice low. "There's a tailor shop in St. Paul looking for a seamstress. The pay is good, and they don't ask many questions about the past." Thomas, who was pulling a tarp over a stack of wood, paused. His smoke-colored eyes turned to me, showing no surprise, just waiting for me to continue. "I didn't say I was going," I said quickly, "but I've been thinking about it. Maybe, Staying in Willow Creek isn't what I should do long term. He was silent, pulling the tarp down and tying the rope tightly, like he was tightening a knot. The sound of the twine grinding on the wood was like something inside me being bound up. "Why?" he asked finally. I gave a bitter smile. "Because I know I've started to depend on something that might not be mine to keep. I lost everything once because I trusted the wrong person. If that happens again," I trailed off, but the empty space was enough for him to understand. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "So you want to leave, just to avoid the possibility of loss?" I avoided his gaze. "Maybe. In St. Paul, I'll just be a name on a payroll. No one will be close enough to hurt me." The wind rustled through the birch circle, and leaves fell around my feet. Thomas stood still, as if afraid that one more step would make me run. "If that's what you truly want," he said slowly, "I won't stop you." The words were gentle but sharp, cutting me where I was weakest. I had expected him to argue, to find reasons for me to stay, but he didn't, and that emptiness was what made me falter. I turned away and walked toward the lake. The water reflected my small silhouette in the wide clearing. For a moment, I saw myself in St. Paul, a cramped rented room, the whirring sound of a sewing machine, a window looking out onto a dusty street. No lake, no sound of horse hooves, no smoke-colored eyes that looked at me as if I didn't have to pretend to be someone else. A birch branch broke and fell, a small sound that brought me back. Behind me, Thomas was still standing there. "I don't promise what I'm not sure I can keep," he said, his voice low. "But I promise, if you leave one day, it will be because you truly want to, not because you're afraid." My chest tightened. The distance between us was shorter than an arm's reach, but as wide as a valley. I sighed, a heavy sound. "I don't know what I'm going to do," I said, "but I won't leave just because I'm afraid." He nodded once, then fell silent. There was no hug. No hand reaching out to hold me back, only the act of standing beside me, letting the wind and time sweep through, testing, and seeing what would remain. As we left the clearing, the sun had disappeared behind the hills, leaving a faint glow like a dying fire. We didn't say another word, but when his hand gently touched my elbow as I stepped over a protruding tree root, I knew the negotiation was over, not with ink and paper, but with our shared, silent agreement. We continued along the trail by the lake, the shadows of the trees stretching long on the damp ground, until he suddenly stopped in a clearing in the woods. "I wanted you to see this," he said, gesturing to a pile of wood covered by an old tarp secured with twine. "I started cutting this wood last winter. Didn't know what I would use it for then." I walked over and gently lifted a corner of the tarp. The planks were smooth and the smell of fresh pine filled the air. "What are you going to build?" "Another room on the cabin," he replied, his voice calm but his eyes were not. "Big enough for 2 or more." I was silent for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, my throat would crack like a broken levee, and all the things I had tried to bury deep inside would come pouring out. The lake in front of me was darkening, the water turning a deep blue with hints of gray, rippling gently in the evening breeze. The last light of day shimmered on the surface, so beautiful it made you forget that winter was coming, but I couldn't forget. In my mind, every image was as clear as if it were yesterday. My parents' wooden stilt house in the Dakota village, where in winter the smell of wood smoke mixed with dried animal hides, and in summer the scent of wild flowers drifted through the windows. That place had been my whole world, until the day it was left with only the sound of the wind and a vast emptiness after my parents died. Then the shabby rented room out east, 4 walls, stained with dampness and mold, a window that was stuck and wouldn't open, and an old bed that smelled like it had been rained on many times. I slept huddled there for months, listening to the rain tap on the roof like the footsteps of someone passing through my life without stopping. And the damp kitchen of a cheap inn, where I worked for a place to sleep. I once sat in a corner of that kitchen, my knees hugged tight to my chest, listening to the sounds of knives and chopping boards outside, and wondering if I would have to live like that for the rest of my life. All the places I had set foot in the stilt house, the rented room, the hired kitchen, were just temporary stops, never places to stay. I took a deep breath, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. "Are you sure?" I asked, my eyes still on the lake. "I don't guess." His voice was low and firm. "I know what I want." I turned back to him. His smoke-colored eyes never left me, and in them I saw not just an invitation to stay, but a blank slate being offered, ready for me to plant whatever I wanted to sow. "I don't want you to have to walk back to town every night. I want you to stay if you want to, too." My chest tightened. Those words were not like the promises I had heard before, vague, fragile promises that would dissolve with a single gust of wind. They were like the sound of a hammer driving a stake into the ground, solid and resounding. I turned away, letting the last light of day hide the emotion on my face. "I want a life where my hands touch the earth," I said slowly, as if testing to see if the words were real, "to plant something and watch it grow. I want to wake up and know the day is mine to decide. I want to belong somewhere again." He walked closer, quietly, unhurriedly. "You belong here." His words were gentle, but they resonated within me like a stake being driven deep into the ground, unshakable. I looked up, allowing myself to meet his gaze for so long for the first time. His face was weathered by the sun, his features not beautiful in an easy way, but beautiful because they had endured, because they had stood firm through storms. I reached out and touched the collar of his jacket. My fingers felt the thick, warm fabric. In that moment, I realized that for all these years, I had been living as a temporary guest in my own life. But right now, I had found a place to drive a stake, to build a real home, even if it was just a small wooden cabin by a lake. "Then build it," I said, my voice trembling but clear like a promise. "I'll help." He didn't smile, just nodded. But in that nod, I heard both relief and determination. The evening wind blew through, carrying the scent of dry wood and birch leaves. I knew that from this moment on, we had agreed without paper, without witnesses, that this would be where I would stay, and he would be the one to help me build it. We married before the snow covered the ground. The wedding was simple, in the back room of the general store, with only Martha as our witness. She wore a dark blue dress, her hair in a bun so tight that even the wind would have a hard time dislodging it. After she finished reading the certificate, she hugged me so tightly that I could barely breathe. Thomas wore his cleanest jacket and the boots he only used on Sundays. I wore a wheat-colored dress, which I had made myself during the late hours after work, each stitch a confirmation that I had chosen this path. We went home after dark, the wind lashing our cheeks with a sharp cold. But neither of us minded. The cabin was lit, the roof had new rafters, and by the door was a second pair of boots, mine. Winter came slowly but settled in deep, the snow covering the roof, and the wind howling around the walls like the long bugle calls of hunters from long ago. I mended the curtains, planted a few flower bulbs in a clay pot to wait for spring. Thomas repaired the cattle pen, built new shelves for the kitchen, and once, I found him meticulously carving a small wooden dish for me to put my hairpins in. We didn't talk much, but everything that needed to be said was evident in the way he placed my boots near the fireplace on snowy nights, or the way I always kept his coffee warm without being asked. One night in late February, I woke up with the feeling that someone was watching me. Thomas was lying next to me, his hand resting lightly on my hip. "A new calf was born," he whispered. Just after midnight. I smiled in the dark. "Spring is coming then." "I think so." Len. When the snow melted in March, we walked along the creek, hand in hand. The water ran strong, carrying the smell of damp earth and the sound of stones rolling on the bottom. I stopped at a bend, looking out at the open field in front of us. "Do you ever wonder what your brother would think of all this?" I asked. He was silent for a long time, then said, "He would say I found what he wanted." I turned to him. "And you?" "I would say I wouldn't trade it for anything." Well, those words didn't disappear with the wind. They settled like a layer of rich soil, nourishing everything we would plant in the years to come. The first spring after our wedding, the earth was as soft as a fresh piece of cornbread, its damp smell rising with the steam from the last melting ice at the edge of the lake. I took off my leather gloves and buried my hands in the brown soil, the cool sensation seeping through my fingers. While Thomas mended the fence, I planted the first potatoes of the season. He didn't say anything, just occasionally glanced at me, the same way he had since the day we met, not intrusive, but not looking away for too long. By June, the smell of wild flowers filled the lakeside. In the evenings, we sat on the porch, listening to the frogs croaking in the wet grass and the sound of fish splashing near the shore. Neither of us needed to say much. The silences between us were like tilled soil, not empty, but ready for any seed to be sown. Then autumn came, bringing long winds and news I never thought I would receive. I was pregnant. I remember that day. I was holding a basket of red radishes I had just harvested when I suddenly felt a little dizzy. Thomas put his shovel down and ran to take the basket from me, his eyes both worried and shining with something I had never seen before. We didn't jump for joy like in the stories I had heard, just stood there for a long time, letting the autumn wind blow through us and letting the news sink in for both of us. That winter was harsh, the snow knee-deep, but inside the cabin, the fire in the hearth was always burning brightly. Thomas built a wooden cradle, each joint as strong as his own hands. I sewed diapers and blankets, and in the middle of sleepless nights, I found myself no longer the woman who had gotten lost on that summer road. I was a part of this place, of this man, and of the child growing inside me. In March, when the creek began to run strong again, our son was born. Thomas held him in his arms, and his smoke-colored eyes softened, as if covered by a thin layer of mist. "He has your eyes," I whispered. He just shook his head. "He has the part that sees the future, like you." We named our son Chaska, firstborn son in Dakota. From that day on, the rhythm of the cabin changed. The baby's cries mingled with the night wind, and the smell of milk with the morning coffee. Thomas taught Chaska to touch the horse's back, to feel its warmth through the thick coat, and I sang my son to sleep with the songs my mother had sung to me when I was little. 2 years later, a baby girl joined us, Winona, firstborn daughter. She had my eyes, but Thomas's smile, a rare sight, but one that warmed the whole room when it appeared. The years that followed passed slowly but richly. In the summer, the whole family would row our wooden boat to the middle of the lake. Chaska learned to fish, while Winona picked white water lilies along the shore. In the autumn, we gathered dry leaves to burn in the yard, the smoke smelling of memories. In the winter, the children built a snowman on the porch. Thomas put an old hat on it, and I wrapped a wool scarf around its neck. Even though our life was peaceful, I didn't forget the newcomers to town, with their strange eyes and calloused hands just like mine once were. Whenever a young woman came to the inn for a job, I would often bring her bread, a potato, or a few skeins of yarn. I didn't give her a complete set of advice, just said, "Stand strong, and keep what's most important for yourself." They usually didn't ask what the most important thing was, but I believe they understood. Martha passed away one golden summer, when the chrysanthemum beds around the inn were in full bloom. I brought flowers from my garden to place by her grave, remembering the tight hug she gave me on the day she signed our marriage certificate. Later, the inn changed hands, but every time I went into town, I still stopped by, leaving something on the windowsill the way someone had once given me a chance. The children grew up with the stories Thomas told them about the grasslands, the cattle drives, and the brother who had left this land behind. Chaska liked to follow his father into the fields, learning how to string a fence and drive stakes. Winona spent more time with me, learning to braid ropes, bake bread, and keep the sourdough starter alive. On some winter evenings, when the snow fell thick, we would sit by the fire, the flames dancing on the wooden walls. Thomas and I would hold hands, not because we needed comfort, but because we had created something worth holding on to, a life built with our own hands, strong enough to withstand the cold wind outside. But happiness was not always smooth sailing. There were years when the crops failed because of drought, and we lost a few cows, so we had to work twice as hard to keep the herd from shrinking further. One winter, a flu epidemic swept through town, and Winona was sick for many days. I stayed awake all night, and Thomas ran to town to find medicine. We went through moments that felt unbearable, but we always got through them. I realized that it was those difficult days that made us cling to each other and to this land even more tightly, because true happiness isn't the absence of storms, but knowing you have someone to stand with you in the rain until it passes. When Chaska turned 12, Thomas taught him to ride to town alone. I stood on the porch, watching the two of them disappear behind the birch trees, remembering myself on horseback all those years ago, when everything was just beginning. Winona, who was 8 at the time, asked, "Were you scared, Mom?" I smiled. "Yes, but sometimes being scared is how you know how much you love something." The years continued to pass. Small wrinkles appeared at the corners of Thomas's eyes, and my hands grew even more calloused from gardening and farming. But every morning, when I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, I still saw the lake glistening in the early light, as if welcoming a new day, no matter how many seasons had passed. Sometimes, on weekends, we would take the children to the big rock by the creek, the place where I used to sit alone and look toward the cabin. Now, their laughter echoed across the bank, erasing the memory of those silent afternoons from long ago. I no longer sat there with a feeling of waiting. I sat there with a feeling of completeness. One summer evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas and I sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. I said, "Do you ever think that if that wagon wheel hadn't broken, we wouldn't have met?" He was silent for a moment, then chuckled softly. "Maybe, but sometimes the best roads start from a broken place." I laughed with him, feeling his hand tighten its grip on mine. The sunset cast a deep, honey-colored glow over everything, and I knew that no matter what tomorrow held, we had traveled a long way from where we both had nothing but a handful of memories and a vague future. Now, I no longer measure time by the number of winters that have passed or the number of harvests we've gathered. I measure it by the meals we've shared, by the sound of our children's feet running through the yard, by the quiet evenings with only the sound of crackling firewood in the hearth. And with every breath, I am grateful for that summer day, the day a wheel broke. Dust covered my dress, and a man stood in the fading sunlight, offering his hand without asking for anything in return. From that moment, I stepped onto a different path, the one that led me home.